The sound of heavy rainfall on the wooden roof masked her sobs, but not the pain etched across Lillian Rowley's face as she clutched her weathered Bible to her chest, sitting alone on the front porch of a homestead that suddenly felt too empty. It was 1878 in the harsh expanse of the Wyoming Territory, and at 27, Lillian had already experienced more loss than most endured in a lifetime. The storm had blown in from the west, dark and unforgiving like the circumstances that had brought her to this moment. 3 weeks earlier, her husband Thomas had been killed by a stray bullet during a bank robbery in the nearby town of Clearwater. Now she sat, drenched in grief as thoroughly as the land around her was soaked by the downpour. Ethan Maddox pulled his hat lower against the rain as he guided his horse through the muddy trail. At 31, he'd spent the better part of his life working cattle drives, but the last 2 years as foreman at the Clearwater Ranch had given him something resembling stability. He was returning from delivering a message to a neighboring ranch when he spotted the small homestead through the curtain of rain. Something made him rein in his horse, perhaps the solitary figure huddled on the porch. Drawing closer, he recognized the young widow Rowley. News traveled fast in small communities, and everyone knew of Thomas's tragic death. Ethan had tipped his hat at the funeral but hadn't spoken to the widow directly. Now, seeing her obvious distress, something pulled him toward the homestead. "Madam." He called out, dismounting and approaching cautiously. "Are you all right out here in this weather?" Lillian looked up, hastily wiping tears from her face. Her auburn hair was coming loose from its pins, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Mr. Maddox, isn't it?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the rain. "From the Morrison place?" "Yes, madam." He removed his hat, rain immediately soaking his dark hair. "I was passing by and—" He paused, unsure what to say. The truth was simple: a woman crying alone had stirred something in him he couldn't ignore. Lillian clutched her Bible tighter. "I was just seeking comfort," she explained, gesturing to the book in her hands, "but the words seem hollow today." Ethan climbed the steps and, with respectful distance, knelt down beside her chair. "My mother always said sometimes the Lord doesn't speak through words but through people instead." He hesitated, then added softly, "Would you mind if I prayed with you, Mrs. Rowley?" The unexpected offer broke something inside Lillian, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She nodded wordlessly. Ethan bowed his head beside her, his deep voice carrying over the sound of the rain as he offered a simple, heartfelt prayer for comfort and strength. When he finished, they sat in silence for a moment, the rain creating a curtain around them. "Thank you," Lillian finally whispered. "I've been sitting here for hours trying to find peace. I didn't expect to find it through a passing stranger." "Sometimes help comes from unexpected places," Ethan replied. He glanced at the darkening sky. "This storm isn't letting up." "Do you have someone staying with you, madam?" Lillian shook her head. "My sister was here until last week, but she had to return to her family in Denver." She attempted a weak smile. "I assured her I would be fine alone." Ethan frowned. "A homestead is no place for anyone to be alone, especially during times like these." He looked toward the barn. "If you don't mind, I could tend to your livestock before heading back to town." "I couldn't ask you to. You didn't ask, madam. I'm offering." Something about the earnestness in his eyes made Lillian nod her acceptance. She watched as Ethan returned to his horse, led it to shelter, and then made his way to the small barn through the downpour. Inside the modest structure, Ethan found 2 milk cows, a few chickens, and an aging workhorse. He set about feeding them, noticing signs that the widow had been struggling to keep up with the chores. The horse needed grooming, the stalls needed mucking, and one of the cows appeared to be developing mastitis. An hour later, soaked to the bone but satisfied with his work, Ethan returned to the house. Lillian had moved inside and opened the door at his knock, a lantern illuminating her tear-stained face. "Your animals are tended to," he said, "but that bay cow might need a veterinary look soon." "I've done what I can for now." "I don't know how to thank you," Lillian said. Please come in and warm yourself by the fire before you go. I've made coffee." Ethan hesitated, aware of propriety, but the chill in his bones and something in her eyes that spoke of a desperate need for human connection made him accept. The small cabin was meticulously kept, but showed signs of Thomas Rowley's absence, a man's coat still hanging by the door, boots in the corner gathering dust. Lillian gestured to a chair by the fire and poured coffee into a chipped mug. "How long have you been at the Morrison Ranch?" she asked, clearly making an effort at normal conversation. "About 2 years now," Ethan replied, warming his hands on the mug. "Before that, I was working cattle drives up from Texas. Decided I wanted something more permanent." "And do you have family nearby?" Ethan shook his head. "Lost my parents to fever when I was 19. No siblings, been on my own since." Lillian nodded, understanding. "Thomas was all I had here. My sister married and moved to Denver 5 years ago." She stared into the fire. "I'm not sure what I'll do now, this homestead, it's too much for me alone." "What are you considering?" Ethan asked. "Selling, I suppose, moving to town, or perhaps joining my sister." She sighed heavily. "Thomas loved this land, we worked so hard for it, but now—" "Land's nothing without hands to work it," Ethan agreed. "But don't make any hasty decisions, Mrs. Rowley. Grief has a way of clouding judgment." They talked until the coffee went cold and the storm outside began to subside. Ethan spoke of his years on the trail, and Lillian shared stories of her childhood in Missouri before coming west with Thomas. There was something easy about their conversation, as if they'd known each other far longer than a few hours. When the rain finally stopped, Ethan reluctantly rose to leave. "I should get back. Mr. Morrison will be wondering where I've gone to." At the door, he paused. "If it's not too forward, Mrs. Rowley, I could stop by again. Check on that cow and maybe help with some of the heavier chores." Lillian looked up at him, something like hope flickering in her eyes for the first time. "I would appreciate that very much, Mr. Maddox." "Ethan, please." "Then you must call me Lillian," he nodded, settling his hat on his head. "Good evening, Lillian. I'll be by tomorrow if I can get away." True to his word, Ethan returned the next afternoon. And the next. Each visit, he would work on necessary repairs around the homestead, fixing fence posts, patching the barn roof, chopping firewood. Lillian would prepare a simple meal in return, and they would talk as the sun set over the Wyoming plains. Word reached Samuel Morrison, Ethan's employer, about his foreman's regular visits to the Rowley homestead. Morrison, a practical man who had known Thomas Rowley, called Ethan into his office one evening. "Heard you've been spending time at the Rowley place," Morrison said, puffing on his pipe. Ethan stood straight, hat in hand. "Yes, sir, just helping the widow with some chores she can't manage alone." Morrison studied him. "Known you 2 years, Maddox. You're a good man, but people talk." "I mean no disrespect to Mrs. Rowley's reputation," Ethan said firmly, "or to Thomas's memory." "I know that." Morrison set down his pipe. "Which is why I'm giving you my blessing to take afternoons off to help her proper-like. That woman needs assistance, and Thomas was a good neighbor." Relief washed over Ethan. "Thank you, sir. Just be mindful," Morrison added. "A widowed woman is vulnerable in more ways than one." Over the next month, as spring settled fully across the territory, Ethan became a fixture at the Rowley homestead. He helped Lillian plant a vegetable garden, taught her how to better manage the livestock, and even repaired the wagon Thomas had been meaning to fix before his death. For Lillian, Ethan's visits became the bright spots in days that had seemed endlessly dark. His steady presence and quiet strength reminded her of Thomas in some ways, yet Ethan was distinctly himself, more reserved, thoughtful in a different manner. Where Thomas had been quick to laugh and speak, Ethan measured his words carefully, but when he smiled, it transformed his entire face. One evening in late May, they sat on the porch after a day of working together. Lillian had baked bread, and they shared it with fresh butter from the now healthy cow. "I've been thinking," Ethan said carefully. "Summer's coming, and with it, more work at Morrison's. I won't be able to come by as often." Lillian felt a sharp pang of disappointment. Of course, you've already done far more than I could have asked. That's not what I meant, he continued. I was thinking we could hire the Jennings boy from town to help you a couple days a week. He's 15, strong, and looking for work. I can't afford to pay him, Lillian admitted. I would take care of that. She set down her plate. Ethan, I cannot accept such charity. It's not charity, he insisted. He struggled to find the right words. It's me keeping a promise. What promise? That day I found you crying with your Bible. I promised to pray beside you, and I have, Lillian, every night since. Not just beside you on your porch, but in my bunk at night. His voice grew soft. I've been praying for your happiness, for your burden to lighten. And I believe part of prayer is being willing to be the answer to it yourself. Tears welled in Lillian's eyes. Why would you do all this for me? Ethan looked at her directly. Because seeing you smile again has become the thing I look forward to most in this world. The confession hung between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge its full meaning. But something had shifted, a door cracked open to possibilities neither had dared consider. The summer of 1878 brought scorching heat to Wyoming Territory. The Jennings boy, Peter, proved reliable and hardworking, coming to help Lillian 3 days a week. Ethan still visited when he could, though the demands of the ranch during summer meant sometimes a week would pass between visits. During one such absence, disaster struck. A fire broke out in Lillian's barn, likely from hay that had been stored too green and heated internally. Peter had spotted the smoke from the road and raced to help, but by the time they had the fire under control, half the structure was destroyed, along with most of the stored hay for winter. When Ethan arrived the next day and saw the charred remains, his heart sank. Lillian stood amidst the debris, her face smudged with soot, looking utterly defeated. I can't do this anymore, she said when she saw him. This is a sign, Ethan. I need to sell and move on. Ethan surveyed the damage. We can rebuild it, better than before. There is no we, Ethan. You have your life at Morrison's. I'm just a charity case you took pity on. The word stung. Is that what you think this is? Pity, what else would you call it? Lillian's voice cracked. A man like you, spending all your free time helping a widow who can barely keep her head above water. A man like me. Ethan stepped closer. What kind of man do you think I am, Lillian? The kind who deserves better than this. She gestured around her. Better than me. In 3 strides, Ethan closed the distance between them. Without hesitation, he cupped her face in his calloused hands. There is nothing better than you in this territory or any other. And then he kissed her gently at first, then with a hunger that surprised them both. When they pulled apart, Lillian's eyes were wide. I'm still in mourning, she whispered, though she didn't step away. I know, Ethan replied, and I respect Thomas's memory. But I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. Just don't give up on this place. Don't give up on the possibility of us. 2 days later, word spread through Clearwater that Ethan Maddox had organized a barn raising at the Rowley homestead. Men from surrounding farms and ranches arrived with tools and lumber, while women brought food and comfort for Lillian. By sunset, a new frame stood where the charred structure had been, and by the end of the week, a barn twice the size of the original was completed. Samuel Morrison himself came to inspect the work. Fine job, Maddox, he said, clapping Ethan on the shoulder. Then, lowering his voice, he added, Thomas would approve, I think. As summer turned to fall, Lillian and Ethan's relationship deepened. They were careful to maintain propriety. He never stayed after dark, and they were rarely alone without young Peter or another neighbor nearby. But everyone in Clearwater could see the change in the widow Rowley. She stood straighter, laughed more freely, and her face had regained its color. For Ethan, each visit to the homestead felt more like coming home than returning to his sparse quarters at Morrison's. He found himself planning improvements, thinking years ahead: a second bedroom added to the cabin, the south field converted to wheat, perhaps an orchard where the rocky soil prevented good grazing. In October, on a crisp evening with the aspen trees blazing gold against the mountains, Ethan arrived at the homestead with more than his usual tools. Lillian greeted him on the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble. "A dangerous pastime," she teased, her smile warming him more than any fire could. "I've saved almost every penny of my wages these past 2 years," he continued. "Enough to buy a small piece of land, but land without someone to share it with is just dirt and rocks." Lillian's breath caught. "Ethan, I'm not Thomas, I know that, and I would never try to replace him in your heart." He took her hands in his. "But I love you, Lillian Rowley. I think I started falling in love with you that first day in the rain when you let a stranger pray beside you." Tears spilled down Lillian's cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of grief. "Thomas would want me to be happy," she said softly. "And you, Ethan Maddox, make me happier than I ever thought I could be again." Ethan dropped to one knee, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "Then marry me, Lillian. Not to save this homestead or because you need help, but because we've found something together worth building a life around." "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes." They were married on Christmas Day in the small church in Clearwater. Samuel Morrison stood as Ethan's best man, and Lillian's sister traveled from Denver to stand beside her. The entire town turned out for the celebration, filling the Clearwater Hotel's dining room with laughter and well wishes. That night, as they returned to what was now their homestead, snow began to fall, dusting the land in pristine white. Ethan carried Lillian across the threshold, setting her down gently before the fireplace he had rebuilt months earlier. "Welcome home, Mrs. Maddox," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lillian's Bible sat on the mantel where she had placed it that morning. She reached for it now, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "I used to think God had abandoned me when Thomas died," she said. "But now I see he was preparing a different path." Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "My mother would say he works in mysterious ways." "Not so mysterious," Lillian smiled, turning in his embrace. "He sent me you when I needed you most." A cowboy who knelt beside a broken woman and showed her how to live again. The winter of 1878-1879 was harsh, but brought its own blessings. Ethan and Lillian weathered blizzards in the snug cabin, planning their future in whispered conversations beneath quilts. By spring, they had decided to keep the homestead rather than buying new land. It was Thomas's legacy, but now it would become theirs too, with new memories layered over the old. Ethan resigned from Morrison's ranch, though he continued to help during roundups and brandings in exchange for use of equipment. The rest of his time was devoted to transforming the Rowley now Maddox homestead into a viable cattle operation, starting with a small herd of 10 cows purchased from a rancher moving east. By summer, their hard work was showing results. The vegetable garden Lillian tended produced enough to sell extras in town. The hay field yielded well, promising winter feed for the growing herd. And in August, when the days were longest and hottest, Lillian shared news that brought Ethan to his knees in grateful prayer they would welcome a child in the new year. "Are you happy?" He asked her one evening as they sat on the porch, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand cradling the small swell of her stomach. "Happier than I ever imagined possible after losing Thomas," she answered honestly. "It's different, this happiness. Deeper somehow because I know how quickly it can be taken away." Ethan nodded, understanding. "That's why we cherish each day, each moment," she corrected, tilting her face up for his kiss. When winter came again, bringing with it Christmas and their first anniversary, the homestead was transformed from a place of grief to one of anticipation. Ethan had finished the second bedroom, now furnished with a hand-carved cradle he'd worked on secretly during the fall evenings. Their child, a daughter they named Hope Elizabeth Maddox, arrived on a clear February morning in 1880, with the assistance of the town doctor and Lillian's sister, who had returned for the birth. Ethan paced outside until the first cries pierced the air, then rushed in to find his exhausted wife cradling their red-faced, squalling daughter. "She has your determination," Lillian said with a tired smile. And your lungs. Ethan carefully took the tiny bundle, marveling at fingers no bigger than matchsticks. She has your beauty, he whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. That night, after Lillian and the baby had finally fallen asleep, Ethan slipped outside to look at the stars scattered across the Wyoming sky. The same stars he'd watched for years as a lonely cowhand, never imagining they would one day shine down on his family, his wife, his child, his home. He remembered the broken woman he'd found crying on this very porch, clutching her Bible as if it were her last lifeline. How her grief had called to something in him he hadn't known existed, a need to protect, to heal, to love. "Thank you," he whispered to the heavens, "for guiding me here that day." By the summer of 1882, the Maddox homestead had expanded to include 40 head of cattle, a flourishing orchard, and a reputation for the finest butter and cheese in the county, Lillian's specialty. Hope, now 2.5, toddled after her father everywhere, wearing miniature boots Ethan had special ordered from the mercantile in town. Visitors to the homestead often remarked on the evident happiness of the family. Few remembered the dark days of Lillian's widowhood, though she never forgot. Thomas's Bible remained on the mantel, a reminder of the path that had led her to this new life. One evening, as summer lightning flashed on the horizon, promising rain for the thirsty land, Ethan found Lillian on the porch, that same Bible open in her lap. Reading or remembering? He asked softly, settling beside her. "Both," she admitted. "I was looking at Thomas's notes in the margins. He used to underline verses that spoke to him." Ethan nodded, no jealousy in his heart. Thomas was part of Lillian's story, just as his own past had shaped him. "Find anything interesting?" Lillian pointed to a passage. "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end." Jeremiah, Ethan identified. He'd grown up in a God-fearing household, though his faith had wandered during his cowboy years, until finding solid ground again with Lillian. "Thomas underlined it the week before he died," she said. "I remember being so angry when I found it later." What kind of expected end was a widow at 27? Ethan took her hand, intertwining their fingers. Maybe the expected end wasn't what happened then, but what happened after. Where you are now. Lillian leaned against him, watching as the first raindrops began to fall. "I think you're right. That day you found me, I was at my lowest. I couldn't imagine a future worth living." She looked up at him, love evident in her eyes. "And now I can't imagine a better life than the one we've built." Inside, Hope called out, awakened by the thunder. Ethan rose. "I'll get her." He returned moments later with their daughter, sleepy-eyed and clutching her favorite blanket. Lillian set aside the Bible and opened her arms. The three of them huddled together on the porch swing, watching as the gentle rain washed over the land they loved. "Mama sad?" Hope asked, noticing the Bible on the table. "No, sweetheart," Lillian assured her. "Mama is remembering and being thankful for rain." The child asked. Ethan chuckled. "Yes, for the rain and for prayers answered in unexpected ways." As the storm passed and stars began to peek through breaking clouds, Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a chance encounter during a rainstorm to this moment of perfect contentment. He had simply stopped to help a widow in distress, never imagining he was riding toward his own future, toward love, family, and a home that was more than just a place. "What are you thinking about?" Lillian asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Ethan smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Just that sometimes the greatest blessings come from the darkest storms." Hope had fallen asleep between them, her small chest rising and falling peacefully. Lillian nodded agreement. "And sometimes God sends exactly what we need, even when we don't know to ask for it." "Like a cowboy passing by in the rain," he teased gently. "Exactly like that," she confirmed. "A cowboy who knelt and promised to pray beside me and who has stood beside me ever since." They remained on the porch until the moon rose high, illuminating their land with silver light. Not just a homestead anymore, but the physical manifestation of a love born from grief, nurtured by faith, and built to last through whatever storms might come. A testament to beginnings found in endings, and to prayers answered in ways far better than either could have imagined on that rainy afternoon 4 years before.